right, so we have finished up chapter 3, lesson 1, which was our introduction to positive and negative numbers, which we said mathematically are just simply called integers. So now we're going to be able to compare them. I can compare positive and a positive, that's pretty easy. Negative and a negative might get a little confusing to some, but most of us will understand it pretty easily. And then positive and negatives, that's the easiest one of all, right? Any positive is always greater than any negative. As I'm going through this, though, it's important that we think about what's being said. Here's the idea of the negatives, which kind of confuses some people, because we've been comparing positive numbers since we started comparing and contrasting numbers since we were little in 1st and 2nd grade. Negatives kind of work in the opposite way that the positives do. When I think about positives, if I talked about positive 7 to a positive 4, I know 7 has a greater value. In the same way, if it was 700 and 400, 700 would be a greater value. Negatives work a little differently. Both of them are on the left-hand side of the zero. Okay? So if that's the case, then I have to realize that the further away I get from the zero, the smaller the value is. In this situation with football, the bigger trouble I am trying to get out of it. The closer to zero I am, the better scenario that I'm in. So this question sets up with football. It says on the first play I'm at a -7, and on my second play I'm at -4. Which was the greater value? Well, when I look at football, and if I think about being on the line, center snaps the ball to the quarterback takes a couple steps back. If he gets hit by somebody on the defense at 7 yards behind where that line of scrimmage was when we began, then I've got 7 yards I still have to make up. That's added to my other 10 yards to get a first down. So instead of having to go 10 yards, now I have to go 17. I've made my job more difficult. To where, if I do the same thing, I take the snap, I'm stepping back, and I get knocked down 4 yards behind the line of scrimmage, I don't have as difficult of a job making it 14 as I do with 17. The idea is that the closer I am to zero, the better off that I am in football. When it comes to numbers, the closer I am to zero, the greater value that I have. The further to the left I go, the smaller the value that I have. When I look at where these numbers are on the -7 and the -4, 4 is closer to 0. I'm only 4 steps behind. To where the -7, I am 7 steps behind. So I know that 7, its value is less than the -4. 4 is closer to 0, so its value is greater than. If I had an arrow there, then the arrow would point in which direction? To the left, right? Because it always is going to point to the smallest number. So we have this to begin with then, looking at not just a horizontal number line, but the idea of the vertical number line where the positives are up above and the negatives are down below. So they give me 6 cities to talk about over the next couple parts of this question. I have Anchorage, Boise, Duluth, Los Angeles, Memphis, and Pittsburgh. Notice they all start with different letters. So the first thing they ask me to do is, well, put those on the number line where they go and put a letter, the first letter of each of them, so I can identify them. That's going to be important because if I just put a whole bunch of dots on that number line, I don't know which is which. When I look at my number line then, I don't have a tick mark for every temperature. Now, if it's important to you to be precise, then you can go ahead and add all of those extra tick marks if you want to. It's not really required though, and I don't need you to do it unless it just makes you feel better mathematically. What I do need to understand though is I'm counting with 2 tick marks for every 10. I have 0 and then I have a tick mark in 10, tick mark in 20, tick mark in 30. So I know those tick marks, they're actually counting by 5s. They're only labeling the second one of each one. So this would be 5, 10, 15, 20, 25, 30, so on and so forth. Going to my negatives, works the same way. If I have 0, then I have -5. This is my -10, -15, -20, -25, -30. So then when I'm placing these, I just have to get close to the number that it's representing. For instance, -17. It's not on there as far as the tick mark goes. However, I know it's further down than -15, but not quite as far down as -20. So I've got to be somewhere in between where the -15 and the -20 is. It's not precise. I'm not going to get out a ruler and measure it and make sure that you are precise about it because the tick marks are not there to be precise. But I know it's somewhere in there, so I'm good. I put my point and I label it A for Anchorage. The +7, same idea. There isn't a 7 there for the tick mark, but I know it's more than 5, but it's not as much as 10. So I just make sure I put a dot there and I label it B for Boise. Duluth is -25. I have a tick mark for that one, so I put it right on the line that's in between the -20 and the -30. The 35 for Los Angeles, I have a tick mark there, so I put it on the tick mark that's between the +30 and the +40 for my Los Angeles. Memphis then, it says it's 18, so not quite to the 20, but definitely above the 15. So I have an M for Memphis, and then Pittsburgh is -5, right on that first negative tick mark for -5. Now that I have those, then I look at this and it says to write the cities in order, right? Sorry, I didn't put it up there. Write the cities in order from least to greatest. Is that what it says? It doesn't. And what ends up happening a lot on our story problems is we end up putting numbers when it says people or names or items, or we put people, names, or items when it says numbers. So I have to make sure that I read what it says. And this says to write the temperatures in order from least to greatest. So I can look at it and say, well, I know that the L is at the top for Los Angeles, so that's the order that they go in. So that has to be the greatest. So I'm going to come down below and go straight up. So I'm going to put them in my order. I have -25 for Duluth, -17 for Anchorage, -5 for Pittsburgh, 7 for Boise, 18 for Memphis, and 35 for Los Angeles. Well, how do I know that? Well, when I first looked at it, I thought, well, I know that Los Angeles is at the top, so that has to be my greatest. So when I put them in order then, I just put them in that reverse order. I started at the bottom and I moved up. Which city had the colder record temperature, Memphis or Pittsburgh, and how do you know? Well, Memphis is here and Pittsburgh is here. That's a positive number versus a negative number, so I know it has to be Pittsburgh. And I know that because negative numbers always have a smaller value than positive numbers. And then this one says, which city had the warmest temperature and how do you know? Well, I look at the very top of my list, it's an L for Los Angeles. So I know Los Angeles had the greatest temperature or the warmest temperature because it's simply at the top of my list. Now, you don't have all of this written down. It's okay. Just pause the video and then move on. If you do have it written down, we're good to go. So now on these, notice I have arrows pointing to the left, and down here I have arrows pointing to the right. The directions are usually going to be very specific as to what they want. I don't have any numbers written down there, so I'm going to actually put the numbers on each of the 3 that we do for these, so you can see specifically which ones we're talking about. But this one says, what are the record temperatures for Boise, Memphis, and Pittsburgh in order from least to greatest? So my Boise is a +7, my Memphis is 18, and my Pittsburgh was at -5. And then I have to put them in order from least to greatest. So I start with my smallest one, -5. Now generally what I do then is I just look for my largest one, so I don't have to really try to get confused as to what goes in the middle. My largest one then is 18, that's what's left. That leaves my 7 right in the middle for Boise. I know my arrows tell me that they're always pointing to the smallest number. -5 is less than 7, and 7 is indeed less than +18. So I know they're right. On my next one then, I have Anchorage, Duluth, and Los Angeles. So I need those temperatures in order to be able to recognize them. So my Anchorage is -17. My Duluth is -25. And then my Los Angeles is way up there for my +35. Now on this one, if I notice the arrows point to the right, my directions say to go from greatest to least. So I have to make sure I follow the directions. So what is my greatest number then? Well, it's the one at the top. So I know 35 has to go way down here at the very beginning. And then I like to then go to what is the smallest one of the entire list. That's going to be my -25. It's going to go in the end. What's left has to be in the middle. -17 is right in the middle. So when I look at it, if I think about my numbers compared to 0, 35 is positive, has to be the greatest value. The next one closest to 0 is indeed -17. So 35 is greater than both of these. However, the negative 17 is closer to 0 than the negative 25. So that has to be the smallest value because it is furthest away from the 0 on the negative side. All right, so this should be pretty easy, right? I'm hoping so. The only thing is I need you to make sure that you pay attention. Make sure that if it's going to be an arrow, that my arrow points to the smallest number. We've said that on multiple lessons through chapters 1 and 2, and it's always going to be the same all the way through school for this year as well as junior high and high school, because you're going to get into inequalities and always comparing inequalities. The key to everything, as I've said multiple times, pay attention, build that muscle memory, have your pencil in your hand, your brain is engaged, you're listening to everything I say, so my ears are open, my brain is thinking, I'm processing, and I'm going step by step, not just copying it down. When I have these, then it says to compare the numbers. So here I'm going to write my arrow. It's either going to point to or point away from. The arrow will always point to the smallest number, and number 1 is the easiest because there's a negative number. The arrow will always point to the negative number because negative numbers are always smaller in value than positive numbers. Well, that means number 2 is also very easy because there's a negative number versus a positive. So this one's going to point to the negative 8. And then I have 3. Well, 3, it has a 0, which is kind of looked at as a neutral number, but still 0 is that measurement line, right, that we always base everything on. And negative 4 is not on it. It's always to the left. So I know that negative 4 is definitely smaller than 0. And then 4, once again, positive and a negative, very easy for me to understand. I know that the arrow has to point to the right because the negative is always smaller in value than the positive. What about these? It says to go in order from least to greatest. All right, so which one is the furthest away from 0 on the negative side? The positive, I already know about that one, but I have 2 negatives. Well, the one that's furthest away from 0 is my negative 7. Then, what is my largest number out of these 3? Well, that's my positive 4, which means I only have one option to be in the middle, and that's going to be my negative 3. Negative 3 is definitely closer to 0 than negative 7, so I know that I have them correct. Negative 7 is my smallest number, negative 3 then, followed by the positive, which has to be my greatest number. On number 6, then I have 0, negative 1, and negative 3. What is my smallest number? Because it says from least to greatest, and the arrow is pointing to the left. Well, the smallest one is always going to be the negative number, right? So my negative 1 has to be there. Then I ask, what's my greatest number? What's the largest one out of the 3? Well, 3 is definitely bigger than 0. So that puts my 0 right in the middle, which makes these arrows true. Negative 1 is less than 0, and 0 is indeed less than the 3. Now on number 7, I have 3 negative numbers. Remember what we said from the beginning on the negatives. It's the one furthest away from the 0 that is the smallest value. When I look at my numbers, then I know negative 9 is further away than any of the others. Which one, therefore, is closest to the 0? It has to be the greatest value. The one closest to the 0 is the negative 3. And then that tells me right in the middle and between the two is going to be my negative 5. Now, if I continue the exact same steps for the next 3, I'm going to get them wrong because this is just the opposite, going from greatest to least. And the arrows are indeed pointing to the right, so I know to the right has to be the smallest number. So on negative 1, negative 4, and positive 2, which one is the greatest amount? Well, I have one positive compared to 2 negatives, so I know I have to start with positive 2. With my 2 negatives, to go over here as my smallest, and I ask which one is furthest away from 0? Well, negative 4 is 4 steps away from 0 compared to the negative 1, which is only 1 step away from the 0. So I know they go in the order of 2, negative 1, negative 4. Well, number 9 should be the easiest one there because they're all considered positive numbers. I know my greatest number out of all of those is going to be my 10. My smallest one is going to be a 0, and then my middle one has to be the 5. When I have all negatives then, when I'm going greatest to smallest, I have to remember that my greatest is the one that's closest to 0. So which out of -5, -4, and -3 is closest to 0? Well, they have them in the opposite order as they're going to be for their answers, don't they? -3 is closest to 0. -5 is the furthest one away, so that's going to be my smallest number, which puts my -4 right smack dab in the middle of the two. Looking at one more before you're allowed to do your homework then. Number 17, dropping all the way close to the bottom. Saturday's low temperature was -6 degrees Fahrenheit. Sunday's low temperature was 3 degrees. Monday's low temperature was -2. Tuesday's low temperature was 5 degrees. Which day's low temperature was closest to 0? So this is one of those where I have positive and negatives, and I could have a positive closer to 0 or a negative that's closer to 0. I actually have to count those steps. I find it easier to just simply draw a very quick number line so that I can see which one is closest to 0. It doesn't ask the greatest value. It doesn't ask the smallest value. It asks which one is closer to 0 out of the 4. So when I plot those, I picked a number line that didn't go all the way, and it's fine, because if that's true, I only have one number that exceeds this number line, right? So I know the -6 has to be over here. My next number they give me is +3, so I know it's going to be there. I have a -2 for Monday, and then Tuesday was a +5. So which one is closest to 0? I have 2 that I can automatically eliminate, right? The furthest away in both directions, I can get rid of those. I'm not even going to consider them. Which one's closest to 0 between the -2 and the +3? Well, when I look at the -2, it is 2 steps compared to the 3, which is 3 steps. So I know that this value has to be closer to 0. So my final answer then is Saturday, because what it asks is which temperature or which day's low temperature. So my answer has to be Saturday. All right, so these are extra in case you're struggling, you don't understand, you have any questions, I'm here to help you. If you get it, you don't have any questions, no problems, then you can go ahead and move on to your assignment. So you have questions, or page 149, questions 2 through 18, and then on the back, the review, page 150, 1 through 6. If you have any questions, come to the back of the room and ask for help.